social creatures. We do not like being alone for prolonged periods of time. I add that little caveat as someone who does enjoy alone time. And if you have toddlers running around the house and opening every door that you might close, you understand sometimes you do just want some peace and quiet. You want to go into a cabin in the mountains away from everyone and be alone. But you eventually want to come back. You want to be around people. We seek out others, and we do that very, very early. Those little children play with each other, first of all, just alongside one another. But then eventually they start growing more and more, and they play with each other, and they do that with other little people with no concern for race or sex or the wealth of the other kid that they're playing with or the appearance of the other kid they're playing with. They just see another little kid that they would like to play with, and they seek them out and can enjoy that time together and say goodbye after the other one's leaving the playground and have enjoyed that 30 minutes together and will never see that other little kid in their entire lives, but they've enjoyed spending time with them. We make friends, we choose spouses, we go throughout our lives seeking out other people. All of this association with other people and that exposure to others doesn't just fill our time. It isn't just something we do because you have to do something. You may as well do it with someone else. It also ends up shaping who we are. We learn from each other by contact. We grow into different people than we might have been otherwise based on our experience with others and our exposure to each other. We call this idea influence sometimes. That's what I want to spend our time this morning considering, is just the power of that simple concept at work, the power of influence. While we're thinking of that, please give me just a moment to thank you all for being here. It is our desire as a group here to influence you, to have an impact upon your life, and especially your walk with Christ. We want to influence you, to inspire and encourage you to be better than you were before you came, to continue ascending towards our God, to continue in the walk that you have begun. And we want to provide whatever encouragement, whatever aid we can do in helping you along the way. That is one of our goals in being here. Ultimately, we want to do all things pleasing to our God. And so we thank you for joining with us, worshiping with us, and helping us in those goals. I hope that it already has been something that you can say is a good usage of your time. I hope that we can add to that as we study together. I first want to just cement in our minds the reality of influence. And in saying that, I mean that it is simply something that will factor into our lives. It is in many ways inevitable. We are constantly on both the receiving end and the giving end of influence, an impact that you have on someone else. And this obviously can be either for good or bad. The point is simply that we do not live in a void. We do not live in a vacuum. You are not immune to it. The people that you are surrounding yourself with are not immune to it. Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 20 paints both of those pictures. He who walks with wise men will be wise, but the companion of fools will be destroyed. You're going to have people rubbing off on you, and you will be doing the same to them. Biblically speaking, we would be able to find, again, examples of both. For both of these first two ideas, these examples that I'm looking at, I chose to look at only kings, really. I just kind of limited myself to that, partially because as I started thinking about it and noticed how many times biblically you have some note of, some record of a king of Israel or a king of Judah being heavily influenced by someone else, it really occurred to me that that's kind of against expectation. That's a little bit contrary to what we might think when you have a king of an ancient nation. This is the most powerful person in the land. This is a person who is sovereign, Their word is law, so to speak. If they say, throw this man in prison, that man's being thrown in prison. If they say, we're going to worship this idol, all the people around you worship that idol. What you say goes in large part. You would think if anyone would be immune to influence, if anyone would be immune to having some other person who's around them constantly affecting the way that they start to act and they start to speak and the things they do or what have you, you would think it would be a king, the most powerful person in the land, right? But in fact, we see these kings oftentimes emulating those around them and falling prey to the influence around them. So, from a negative perspective, you think of Rehoboam in 1 Kings chapter 12. He begins his reign. He wants to figure out, how am I going to carve my path forward as king now that I'm taking over from my father Solomon? And in sort of deciding how he's going to have his administration go, he talks to a few different camps of advisors. He's got the older men who are around his dad. They tell him one thing: go easy on the people. They'll love you, and then they'll do whatever you ask them to later. But then he goes to his peer group, the younger men, his friends, his buddies, probably, since he's been a wealthy prince his whole life. These are yes men who've attached themselves to him. And he says, what do you guys think? Be a tough guy. They only thought Solomon was hard on him when he was taxing them and when he was trying to get them to do things for him. You go twice as hard. You really show them that you're not to be trifled with. And he's influenced by that. He ends up listening to those guys because, well, they're telling me what I want to hear. They're pointing a path forward that I think sounds kind of appealing. Or think of his father, Solomon, the father of Rehoboam, one of the famous kings of Israel. We are told in the chapter previous to that, 1 Kings chapter 11, describes those 1,000 women that Solomon had surrounded himself with, and uses a couple of phrases that are instructive. He had a love for them that pulled him away from God. It says they turned his heart from the Lord. That's what people might do that are around us. If we love them more than God, if we love them more than what we should place in first priority, if we simply have surrounded ourselves with the wrong people, with the wrong motivations, we too might have our hearts turned away from the Lord. Or another king, Ahaziah. We are told of him that he walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother advised him to do wickedly. He had a bad influence coming from his own mother, in fact. He did evil in the sight of the Lord and took as his counselors these people who convinced him to do that. To his destruction, the chronicler says for us. We would also have positive examples, though, again, coming from among the kings. I suppose maybe a mixed example of King Joash. We are told King Joash's story in 2 Kings chapter 12 with a maybe kind of subtle reminder that things did not turn out so well for King Joash. Verse 2 of that chapter says that he was faithful to the Lord all the days in which Jehoiada the priest instructed him. And really that's kind of the last word on the matter as far as 2 Kings is concerned. When you turn over to 2 Chronicles, you see that when that priest Jehoiada died, then Joash was not faithful to the Lord. And he killed the son of Jehoiada, who spoke against him. And he did many things that were wicked in the eyes of God. The full story of his apostasy is told that positive example was really the only thing restraining him from evil earlier in his life. And really, biblically, there is in general a tendency that those who sought out the faithful were often strengthened, and they were often benefited from that practice. When they surrounded themselves with people that were of high character, that were of integrity, that were of godliness, that tended to have a bracing and strengthening effect on the people in question. We think of the apostles, for instance, and really they give us a good example of the discipleship method of teaching. When you were a disciple, it was not just like being a student in school, where you go for a few hours a day and the teacher gives you the multiplication tables and you get a prize if you answer the questions right or whatever it might be. When you're a disciple of someone, you follow the teacher around everywhere. You go where they go. You're seeing how they behave. You're understanding the whole pattern of their life. Yes, they're talking to you during that time, but what you're gaining from them is this immersive instruction. You're spending time with the rabbi, with the teacher, for prolonged periods of time. You absorb everything that they do. You don't just learn a few things for as long as it takes you to take the test and get graded on it and then forget all of that. No, you've spent hours with this person, seeing them in different situations and finding out how they react, and if they can actually put into practice the philosophy that they would be teaching you. Because if you're following along a rabbi who says, do good to those who persecute you and bless those who curse you, and then someone comes up and curses him and he gives him a right cross in the jaw, then you say, well, maybe this person isn't teaching anything that's actually worthy of acceptance. He can't live it. He can't practice it himself. Who is this? Why would I listen to him? No, you follow a rabbi and see, is his message sustainable? Is he actually doing what he has said is good for a person to do? But we see the benefit of that learning through influence. A positive example. We would find biblically as well some admonitions to provide good influence, to be the source of something useful and instructive in a productive way for the people around us. Brother Forrest read Matthew chapter 5 for us a moment ago. Verses 13 through 16 is a part of the opening section, really, of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. But he uses two familiar images there to describe that his listeners must be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Those are two things that have a useful effect on the things around them. Salt is preservative. It staves off decay. It staves off destruction when you place it on something. It preserves the things that it's being applied to. He says, you be that. Because he is sending these people into the world. You be the salt of the earth. You be the one that might be the only stopgap in the way that is preventing people from greater moral decay. You provide the salt. You be the light of the world. When you're inhabiting a darkened world, the people who have no clear illumination and no path forward, they do not have understanding. They're clawing around in ignorance. You shine the light on them. You illuminate the path forward. You point through your deeds towards your Father and glorify your Father in heaven when men see the things that you are doing. Be the light of the world. Or you would find Paul in a couple of places speaking to younger ministers of the gospel. First, turn to 1 Timothy chapter 4. We'll just read these briefly and see exactly what it is Paul is telling his younger co-workers here. 1 Timothy chapter 4, beginning in verse 12. He's writing to Timothy, of course, and tells him to let no one despise his youth. But, he says, be an example to the believers in word and conduct, in love and spirit and faith and purity. Till I come, give attention to reading, to exhortation, to doctrine, and do not neglect the gift that is in you, which was given to you by prophecy with the laying on of the hands of the eldership. Meditate on these things, give yourself entirely to them, that your progress may be evident to all. And then pay attention again to verse 16. Take heed to yourself and to the doctrine. Continue in them, for in doing this you will save both yourself and those who hear you. So he's beginning with the idea of being an example to everyone. And he uses kind of an inclusive list of modifiers there. An example in word, conduct, love, spirit, faith, purity. Anything that people can observe of you needs to be exemplary. Why? Because that matters. They will start taking their cues from you. So he finishes in verse 16. You're not only doing something that's good for yourself, and you'll end up finding salvation through your own life forging ahead in this way, but you'll save those who hear you. You need to be a good influence on them. He says something similar to Titus. Titus chapter 2, and beginning there in verse 6. Paul writes likewise to Titus and says to exhort the young men to be sober-minded in all things, showing yourself to be a pattern of good works, in doctrine showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility, sound speech that cannot be condemned, that one who's an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say of you. Show yourself to be a pattern of good works. Why? Why is that important for Titus? Because he's working among these people and they need to be able to see something in him that they can pattern their own lives after. Now, the other side of this coin, of course, is a warning, a frequent warning that is given in the Scripture about being exposed to a bad influence. That can have a profound negative effect upon our lives. Since we are susceptible to the influence of other people, if we are allowing that to be a negative one that we take in. The most straightforward statement to this effect maybe would be in 1 Corinthians 15. In verse 33, Paul says very simply there, to not be deceived, but to recognize that evil company corrupts good morals or corrupts good habits. It has a negative effect, a disastrous effect. In Galatians 5, beginning in verse 7, he asks the saints in those Galatian churches, essentially, what's going on? How have you guys gotten this far off track? You ran well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? And he answers his question in large part in verse 8. This persuasion does not come from him who calls you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. There's a statement you find several times in Scripture to make really the same point that we're talking about. Leaven will have influence. You put a little bit in the dough and it makes the whole loaf rise. Paul is telling these saints here, you've started doing something that is not good. It's harmful. It's not from God. So you need to start getting rid of that bad influence. Romans chapter 12 and verse 2 tells us not to be conformed to the world. It's very easy to do that, to simply put ourselves into the mold that is presented and conform to the world and take on the influence of everything around us that is contrary to God. Scripture says don't do that. Be careful of that influence. And of course there is, maybe most frequently, a condemnation for providing a bad influence. Scripture actually talks about this more than it does warn us against. Now, having the wrong friends may harm you. Associating with bad people might have a bad effect. We get that warning, but more often than that even, is the Lord telling us, do not be the bad influence that causes some other one harm. That's what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 18, beginning in verse 6, when he's cautioning people about what to do with these little ones, with those who are his children, with those who are the faithful in him. It says offenses are going to come in the world, but woe to him through whom the offenses come, who might cause one of those little ones to stumble. That's when you're really in trouble. It would be better for you if you really had never been born, if you were pulling people away from you. When he's condemning the scribes and the Pharisees in chapter 23 of Matthew, he pronounces a woe, one of the many woes he pronounces on them, because, in part, he says, you'll travel the earth to make a disciple and win a proselyte over to your cause. What are you doing with that disciple that you make? You make him twice as much a son of hell as yourself. It's bad enough that you're already condemned. Now you're pulling these other people in after you. Don't be that bad influence. Ezekiel chapter 34 is one of the several places, one of the many places within the volumes of the prophets where you have the strongest language possible used against those who should have been the leaders of Israel and Judah, who should have been guiding the people in a right way, but instead had influenced them towards evil. And so he pronounces there a woe upon those shepherds of Israel. Look at verse 4 of Ezekiel 34. The weak you have not strengthened, nor have you healed those who were sick, nor bound up the broken, nor brought back what was driven away, nor sought what was lost, but with force and cruelty you have ruled them. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd, and they became food for all the beasts of the field where they were scattered. My sheep wandered through all the mountains. and on every high hill. Yes, my flock was scattered over the whole face of the earth, and no one was seeking or searching for them. These shepherds had not been faithful to their charge. The prophets of the people, the elders of the people, the shepherds of the people, the kings of the people, the priests of the people, they had not influenced the people towards godliness. They had led them down a path of destruction and idolatry. And so we see the Lord reserving his strongest remarks for those who provide a bad influence. We must at all costs avoid that. But really, we see, scripturally speaking, as well as just an observable nature, we just understand the reality of influence, that it is something that happens so very often in our lives. I do want to make a few points along these lines, however, of being realistic about influence. A few adjustments to that idea, I guess, if you'll allow me. And the first is simply this, that we cannot always choose our surroundings and who our influences are. We can sometimes. And any admonition I would have given in that first part of saying, yeah, evil company corrupts good morals. So obviously don't surround yourself with evil company. Pick good friends. Pick a good spouse. Pick a good place to be. Everything that is within your power, choose godly people, wise people, strong people to be around. But I also recognize that it's very easy to tell someone, surround yourself with good people. But what about that child who's being raised by abusive parents? What about that woman whose husband denies and ridicules the Lord? And she leaves the house on Sunday morning to go attend worship with the saints and has abuse heaping upon her back as she closes the door and cold laughter. Is it of great help to tell her, choose your associations wisely? This is what she's returning home to. What of the man whose co-workers are wicked? Well, we'll tell him to get a different job. Work in a different industry. Put food on the table in a different way. Keep the lights on in a different way. And it's just very easy for me to say that. I'm not living that man's reality. What are the kids whose classmates daily are trying to induce all kinds of reckless misbehavior? The simple reality is just simply this. We cannot always choose our influences. Well, what do we do then? Ultimately, there is personal responsibility stressed throughout the Scripture. We are told often, for instance, to choose a right path to follow, for instance. That kind of language is used very frequently. A way or a road, some kind of thing that you get a Robert Frost kind of imagery of picking one of those ways to go. And biblically, it's not said, well, your parents are already leading you down one of these paths, or your spouse wants you to go down one of them, so, what are you really going to do? Or, Timmy at school is going to be mean to you if you don't go down the left path, so go right. No, it says you choose. You decide which one of those you are going to do. Personal responsibility. It will be up to us to figure out how to respond. Understanding that we must incorporate the good things that we see from the good that is around us. And that we avoid strenuously the bad things that surround us from the bad people who will surely surround us in many different walks of our lives. It's a mark of wisdom to be able to discern those things from one another. Whether I'm receiving right now a good influence towards life, towards holiness, towards righteousness, or whether this person who may voluntarily or involuntarily be in my life, whether I'm receiving something that is a destructive, negative influence upon me. And that really gets to the heart of Paul's warning that we saw there in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 33. How did he preface that remark, that evil company corrupts good morals? Do not be deceived. Don't fool yourself, because the fool does think that it doesn't matter who and what he surrounds himself with. Paul says, don't be deceived. It does have power. It does have an effect on you. So be aware of that going into it. Be aware of that in every relationship. That this person is going to have some effect on you. There are limits to that. We'll talk in a moment about some of the limits on that. But they will have some effect. Do not be deceived. The wise person, when it is within his control, seeks out the best company that he can. Let us also say that a good influence doesn't always take. It doesn't always stick. Sometimes, despite our best intentions, every intention that we have to exert a positive effect upon the people around us, it seems to matter very little. Sometimes you go and you go and you go and you work and you work and you work and you try. They don't listen. They don't change. Nothing seems to happen. From this general point, let me close with three considerations, all kind of in line with this idea. The first, simply, let me say, don't be discouraged by this. Don't find yourself abandoning hope. Don't find yourself giving up and quitting because it doesn't seem like you are making any headway with this good influence that you are trying to have upon someone. Sometimes the effect may be working inwardly at a slow pace, maybe in small increments, invisible to the naked eye. You think of how many things happen that you don't observe if you're watching them happen. If you watch a shadow on the wall somewhere, you have to stare at that for a long time before it starts moving with the sun. We use watching paint dry or grass grow as adages for something that is very boring because you don't really even see that anything is happening. And sometimes our influence upon people for godliness works in that same way. Not over minutes, but over years, over decades, maybe over the course of a lifetime. But you might see eventual results. You might eventually find that person where it clicks, where it snaps into place, and they understand finally, here is what I should have been doing all along. And when that happens, there is really nothing better. There is nothing that feels greater than that person finally doing what they need to do and maybe understanding what you've been trying to influence them towards your whole life. I looked several weeks ago, this maybe was a few months ago, I guess. I just happened to see on the website for a congregation where I was right after college. I worked with the College View Church in Florence, Alabama. And I saw on their website they had a video of their Wednesday night class or something. And the man that was teaching that class was a man that I baptized on almost my last Sunday working with that church, who had been there not as a believer, not as a seemingly interested participant at all, but had been there for the 6 years that I worked with that church, attending most of the time, kind of sitting there, oftentimes with a scowl, or oftentimes just there because his wife was twisting his arm maybe to get him through the doors. But again, on nearly the last Sunday that I was working with that church, he came and wanted to be baptized. He became a Christian. And from that point on has continued to grow, has continued to influence others, has continued to learn, and now is continuing to teach and continuing to offer his help and continuing to work within that congregation. Nothing feels better than that. When you think that you have just been punching against a wall for so long and you finally go through. Keep at it. Don't be discouraged. Let's also say, very much in line with that, recognize that your good influence might be restraining an even greater evil. Sometimes we look at that weak Christian, for instance, we're trying to work with, and we're trying to bring along, and it just seems like nothing is getting through. And here I am spending all this time with them, trying to help them out as much as possible, and they are just still weak as a newborn colt. That weak Christian may not even be a believer if you are not influencing them. Or that child, those children who are straying, may be completely lost and gone without you, restraining them from something even worse. It's easy to get discouraged when we see people that are not where we'd like them to be. But we recognize, or we need to recognize, where else might they be if we were not trying to help? If someone was not there to keep them from something even worse. And so again, the admonition here would be, keep at it. Don't grow discouraged. Continue to help. Don't take away the hand that assists and that holds up just because someone is not where we want them to be. Continue working with them. We can never properly measure how much we might be doing. We don't have the time machine or whatever scientific gadget we would need to show alternate realities and would show what might be happening if we were not here. We just don't know. Keep doing all that you can. Stay with it. Let me finish by saying this, that just spending time with someone is not really enough. Your presence alone, your exposure alone, isn't going to cut it. And oftentimes maybe we make I believe, false distinction between influence and teaching, for instance. There are people I would talk to about the gospel, and there are people that I would just say, well, I can be a good influence upon them. They're not going to listen if I preach to them, so I'll just hang around them. And we'll be friends, and we'll spend good quality time together, and that's being a good influence upon them. Because I'm good, and I'm not going to be doing bad things, and that'll rub off on them. That might be true to an extent. But let me say very plainly, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean your coworkers are going to become Christians too. You spend 40 hours a week with them, so there they go. They see you every day. You're having a good effect on them just by being around. I won't dispute that. But that probably isn't going to be enough. Your kids are not going to be believers just because you're a believer. You need to teach them. You need to instruct them. Just them seeing that you're not a bad guy is not going to be enough. Simple presence and exposure is powerful, but it's not enough. We have the adage we use sometimes in talking about, trying to teach someone, trying to teach a non-believer something. We say they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Well, that's true. And again, I won't dispute that. Let me add on to that, however, as I often feel as one who proclaims the gospel that saves, the gospel that alone saves. If it comes into your heart, you believe it, you accept it, and you act upon it. Let me add to that, I don't care how much you care, unless you can teach someone to know what they need to know, and unless you bring them along to the knowledge that saves. You could say you care about that person, you like hanging out with them, you like spending time with them, and they consider you a friend. Do that all you want. But if no knowledge is ever imparted, we haven't really done anything. Again, that teaching and instructing and grounding in truth all have to come eventually. It's not enough to like the same baseball team, like going to the same restaurant. I believe this happens. I say this not in judgment of anyone, certainly. It's easy for me to fall into this. I believe this process happens where we say, I'll just be a good influence. Because it's easier to make friends than it is to make disciples. Again, you can bond over anything. You can be friends with, you like the same music, we root for the same football team. We work together and talk about our kids or whatever it might be. There's a lot of things you can find some common ground with people and be a good friend. That's valuable. You should do that. But you need to make disciples. And a disciple isn't just someone that says, I know a Christian, and we're on good terms with each other. A disciple is someone who believes in Jesus Christ and follows him. Make disciples. Make friends. Make friends first, maybe. But just influence is no substitute for truly teaching someone. So let's do both. Let's find ourselves truly imparting on people what they will need. You show through example, as Paul would say to Timothy and Titus. Show yourself a pattern of good works, but give attention to teaching and to doctrine, the reading of Scripture, and the things that men will need to actually find their way to Jesus Christ.